Beneath the waters of the St. Lawrence River lies a graveyard of entire towns, 9 communities, over 6,500 people. Their homes, churches, schools, businesses, and memories were deliberately flooded in 1958 to create what governments called a triumph of engineering. The St. Lawrence Seaway was built to connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, creating a shipping route that would change commerce in North America forever. It was celebrated as one of the greatest engineering feats of the 20th century. President Dwight Eisenhower called it a triumph of American-Canadian cooperation. Queen Elizabeth II attended the official opening. Newspapers declared it the greatest public works project of the age. But here's what most people don't know. To build the Seaway, the governments of the United States and Canada deliberately chose to flood 9 entire communities. These were real towns with real history. Some had been settled for over 200 years. Families had lived in these places for generations. When the decision was made to flood them, residents were given only months to pack up everything they owned and leave forever. Many of them never recovered. Some died within years of relocation. Others spent the rest of their lives suffering from displacement trauma. The governments called it the price of progress, but that price was paid by ordinary people who had no choice. This is the story of the lost villages of the St. Lawrence, a story of sacrifice, trauma, and a history that America and Canada have worked very hard to forget.
The St. Lawrence River had always been the heartbeat of North American commerce. For centuries, ships traveled between Montreal and the Great Lakes, carrying furs, timber, grain, and manufactured goods. But there was a problem. The St. Lawrence River dropped nearly 70 feet between Lake Ontario and Montreal. This created dangerous rapids, the Cedar Rapids, the Cascades, the Lachine Rapids. For years, ships had to navigate around these obstacles using canals. But these canals were old and shallow. They couldn't accommodate large modern ships. By the middle of the 20th century, the Seaway was becoming an obsession for business and political leaders in both the United States and Canada. They saw enormous economic potential, access to the heart of North America for ocean-going vessels, cheap transportation of bulk commodities like iron ore from Quebec and Labrador, hydroelectric power generation, the promise of unlimited prosperity. The idea of a seaway wasn't new. As far back as the 1800s, engineers had proposed such a project. But for decades, opposition was fierce. The railroads opposed it because it would reduce freight they carried. Atlantic coast ports opposed it because they wanted ships to come to their ports, not go to the Great Lakes. Some American politicians opposed it because they wanted Canadian dependence on American Erie Canal routes. For decades, the proposal languished in committees and studies. But after World War II, American and Canadian governments became increasingly committed to the project. The Cold War created new urgency. Eisenhower's administration saw the Seaway as strategically important for military and economic reasons. On May 13, 1954, Eisenhower signed the Wiley-Dondero Seaway Act. The decision was made. Ground would be broken at Massena, New York on August 10, 1954. The St. Lawrence Seaway would be built. But there was something the governments didn't emphasize. Building the Seaway would require flooding vast sections of the St. Lawrence River. Dams would be built, water levels would rise, and in the path of that rising water sat 9 communities, 9 towns with names that most people have never heard of. Aultsville, Dickinson's Landing, Farran's Point, Maple Grove, Moulinette, Santa Cruz, Wales, and Woodlands. These towns had been established in the late 1700s and early 1800s. They were genuine communities with deep roots. Families had farmed the same land for generations. Businesses had operated for over 100 years. Church congregations had worshipped in the same buildings for 2 centuries. Archaeological sites from indigenous peoples were scattered throughout the region, some dating back thousands of years. But none of this mattered to the governments planning the Seaway. The decision was made. These communities would be sacrificed.
When groundbreaking ceremonies occurred on August 10, 1954, the residents of the 9 communities had already received notice. They would have less than 5 years, perhaps less than 4 years. That's how long they had to prepare for the complete destruction of their world. The governments didn't ask. They didn't negotiate. They announced the decision like executives announcing a business plan. Take what you can carry. Leave the rest behind. The initial offers of compensation were shockingly low. Residents were told they would receive payment based on property valuations that the government determined. In many cases, these valuations were far below actual property values. A family farmhouse that had been built 100 years ago and carefully maintained might be valued at $10,000. Relatives would lose not just a house, but a home full of memories. A cemetery that had served a community for 2 centuries. Graves that dated back to the 1800s. Those graves had to be relocated. But who would pay for it? The governments said residents must do it themselves. Over the next 5 years, a massive construction project unfolded. 22,000 workers at peak employment. Construction equipment moving earth and rock on a scale almost incomprehensible. Dams were built. Water pumps worked continuously. Massive amounts of concrete were poured. Engineers worked around the clock. The project moved forward with military precision. But while the engineering marvel was being celebrated, the residents of the 9 communities were experiencing something very different. Imagine being told that in 4 years, the place where you grew up will cease to exist. The house where you were born will be underwater. The church where you were married will be demolished.
The cemetery where your parents are buried will be flooded. Your neighbors are packing up. Half your town is already gone. The school closed last year because there are no more children. The stores are being emptied. It's like watching your world disappear in slow motion. Many residents were elderly. They had lived their entire lives in these communities. The thought of starting over at 60, 70, 80 years old was devastating. Families that had farmed the same land for generations watched that land become worthless. Nobody wanted to buy a house or farm that would soon be underwater. Some residents simply gave up. They accepted the government's low offer and left. Others fought. They tried to organize opposition. They wrote letters to politicians. They created petitions. But the decision had been made at the highest levels of government. There was no appeal. There was no mercy. The Seaway would be built. The cemetery situation became its own tragedy. Families were told they had to relocate graves from the cemeteries that would be flooded. This was expensive. It required paying to have graves exhumed. It required finding new cemetery space in other towns. It required paying for reburial ceremonies. For families with limited resources, these costs were prohibitive. Some families couldn't afford to relocate their relatives. Some couldn't find new burial sites that would accept the remains. Some were too traumatized to deal with the logistics of exhumation. In the end, not all graves were relocated. Some remained in place. They are still underwater. Beneath the waters of the St. Lawrence River lie the graves of people from 2 centuries ago. Their bones rest on the riverbed, their existence acknowledged by neither government. The psychological toll on residents was severe. Historical records and anecdotal evidence suggest that many elderly residents suffered depression, anxiety, and even premature death in the years following relocation. The stress of losing everything, of starting over in a new place, of abandonment by their government proved too much. There are accounts of residents after relocation spending their final years trying to recover from the loss of their home. One account describes an elderly woman who moved to a new town after leaving her family farmhouse of 70 years. She died 2 years later without ever adapting to her new location. These were not statistical casualties of a development project. These were human beings experiencing the destruction of their world. In June 1958, the first stage of flooding began. Water began rising. The reservoirs behind the dams started filling. Residents who hadn't already left had to leave immediately. The water rose faster than expected in some areas. Residents watched from a distance as their former homes began disappearing beneath the water. Churches they had worshipped in for their entire lives sank. Schools where their children had learned submerged. Cemeteries disappeared underwater. Some residents reported that they could see their former homes silhouetted beneath the water for days after the flooding. The sight was profoundly disturbing. By July 1958, 9 entire communities had been erased. But something was overlooked in the rush to complete the project. In the frenzy of evacuation and relocation, not all graves were relocated. Some cemeteries were partially emptied, but not completely. Some family burial plots were never located or relocated. In at least one documented case, an entire small cemetery was accidentally left in place and flooded. The remains of at least 30 people were left underwater. Additionally, Indigenous burial sites and archaeological sites throughout the region were flooded without proper documentation or respect. Artifacts and remains were deliberately or negligently left in place. The governments simply didn't care enough to preserve them. There's also the matter of what happened to some residents who refused to leave. Official records say that all residents were eventually relocated by 1858, but there are anecdotal accounts of at least 2 residents who refused to evacuate. According to some local histories, one elderly man refused to leave his farm. He was forcibly removed by authorities. Another resident reportedly hid in the woods to avoid evacuation, though eventually authorities found him and forced his relocation. These accounts are not part of official histories. They don't appear in government documents, but they persist in local memory and family stories passed down through generations. Another mystery involves the official compensation paid to residents. The U.S. government and Canadian government each determined their own compensation formulas, but the formulas were controversial. Many residents received compensation far below what their property was actually worth. Some residents sold their land to the government for a fraction of its value because they felt they had no choice. Decades later, when it became clear that the Seaway had generated enormous economic benefits, many residents who had relocated felt cheated. They had sacrificed their homes for the promise of national prosperity. But that prosperity went to corporations and shipping interests. It didn't go to the residents of the lost villages. There's also the question of what happened to the towns themselves. Why haven't they been archaeologically studied more extensively? Why haven't memorial sites been built? Today, scuba divers can explore the underwater ruins. They report seeing foundations, roads, and artifacts, but there's been remarkably little official effort to document or preserve this underwater heritage. Some historians believe this is deliberate. Governments would prefer that these communities be forgotten. Official celebrations of the Seaway emphasize economic benefits and engineering achievement. They say very little about the human cost. On April 25, 1959, the first ship passed through the completed Seaway. On June 26, 1959, Queen Elizabeth II and President Eisenhower formally opened the Seaway aboard the royal yacht Britannia. The event was celebrated as one of the great achievements of the 20th century. Television cameras showed the dignitaries aboard the yacht. Bands played. Crowds cheered. Newspapers ran headlines about progress and cooperation between nations. The achievement was real. The engineering was genuinely impressive. Over 6 million cubic yards of concrete had been poured. 22,000 workers had labored for 5 years. The Seaway would revolutionize shipping in North America.
Ships that previously had to go all the way around to Canadian Atlantic ports could now sail directly to the heart of the continent. But the official celebration said nothing about the lost villages. It said nothing about 6,500 displaced residents. It said nothing about cemeteries underwater. It said nothing about psychological trauma and loss. The celebration was entirely focused on progress and economic benefit. This was the official narrative, and it was the narrative that would be taught in schools. It was the narrative that would appear in history books. For decades, most North Americans had no idea that building the Seaway had required flooding entire communities. When I say erasing history, I don't mean figuratively. I mean literally erasing it. The communities were gone, and the government made sure the story of those communities disappeared as well.
The St. Lawrence Seaway became one of the busiest shipping routes in North America. Billions of tons of cargo have passed through it since 1959. Iron ore from Quebec and Labrador, grain from the Great Lakes regions, coal, salt, automobiles. The Seaway generated enormous economic benefits. Cities near the Great Lakes prospered. Shipping companies grew wealthy. But the economic benefits never reached the people who had sacrificed their homes. In fact, ironically, many of them ended up poorer than before relocation. Property values in the new towns where they relocated were often higher than the compensation they received. Many residents spent their remaining years struggling financially. Over the decades, most North Americans forgot about the lost villages. Few people knew the Seaway had required such a human cost. The stories passed down through families of people directly affected became quieter with each generation. By the 1980s and 1990s, most people had no memory of the lost villages. To them, the Seaway was simply there, a waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the ocean. Nothing mysterious about it, nothing tragic about it. But starting in the 1980s, interest in the lost villages began to grow. Local historians in the region started researching what had been lost. They interviewed elderly residents who had been evacuated. They collected old photographs and documents. They recorded oral histories. They began to piece together the story of the communities that had been erased. Museums dedicated to the lost villages were established. The area around the former communities became a tourist destination. Scuba diving became popular as divers explored the underwater ruins. In 1997, a memorial was built to honor the lost villages. It includes a museum and exhibits describing the communities that were flooded. But interestingly, the memorial was built not by government initiative, but by local historical societies and volunteers. The governments never offered to build a proper memorial. It took decades of work by local people to finally create a place where the lost villages would be remembered. Today, the St. Lawrence Seaway remains one of the most important shipping routes in North America. But it's also become a symbol of the cost of progress. The underwater ruins serve as a literal graveyard of communities that were sacrificed. The cemeteries underwater serve as a reminder that the most vulnerable people often pay the price for grand national projects. The story of the lost villages is a story about power,
about decisions made by governments far removed from their consequences, and about people whose lives were destroyed so that others could benefit economically.
Beneath the waters of the St. Lawrence River lie 9 communities. Their roads are still visible. Their foundations remain. Their artifacts are scattered on the riverbed. Their cemeteries rest underwater. Over 6,500 people were displaced. Many never recovered. Some died from relocation trauma. Some had their graves flooded. Some refused to leave and were forcibly removed. And the governments of 2 nations deliberately ensured that these stories would be forgotten. They celebrated the engineering achievement. They said nothing about the human cost. The most troubling question about the lost villages remains unanswered. How many graves are actually still underwater? How many remains of indigenous peoples are on the riverbed? What artifacts were lost? What histories were erased? The governments have shown no interest in finding out. No systematic archaeological investigation has been conducted. The underwater communities remain largely unexplored and undocumented. It's as if the governments want to keep them buried, literally and figuratively. The story of the St. Lawrence Seaway shows us something important about how history is written. Official narratives focus on achievement and progress. They minimize or eliminate stories of human suffering. They celebrate the powerful and forget the vulnerable. The lost villages could have been remembered. Their story could be taught in schools. Proper memorials could have been built decades ago. But instead, it took nearly 40 years before anyone bothered to remember them. If you want to uncover more stories of American infrastructure that hide dark histories, subscribe to Hidden America. Next time, we'll explore the construction of the interstate highway system and discover how entire communities were destroyed to build it. We'll investigate the environmental disasters that were covered up. We'll meet the people whose neighborhoods were demolished for progress. And we'll ask why America continues to repeat the same pattern, sacrificing the vulnerable for national projects. Subscribe now for more hidden infrastructure stories. And the next time you travel on a highway or see a major construction project, remember the lost villages. Remember that behind every triumph of engineering, there may be a story of sacrifice, history that someone doesn't want you to know.